All right, welcome to episode 45. We're going to look at moving from imperative to functional as we progress towards more of a real world app kind of a thing. And I want to show kind of some of the way that might look in an imperative fashion and then move forward. And what we'll end up with this episode is purely functional implementation of this. So hopefully you enjoy that. So we start off with our imperative here. And this is very, very imperative. This is using Node. So this is coming from a Node server. So we're going to require a request here so that we can issue the request. And basically we're going to get Google. We're going to issue a request to Google, which is what this request does. So Google, here's the URL. And then we're passing a callback. And that callback, in this case for request, takes an error, a response, and a body. And then inside of that, once all that's done, we're going to check to see if there's an error, and if there is, then we'll console error it. And then we're going to console log the response status code. So with all of this, there's no need for semicolons, but that was copied from request. So we're doing all of this. There's all sorts of gotchas throughout all of this because it's imperative. A lot of this are it's statements that we're dealing with. We've got this function here. We're checking if error. Notice how this console log was not an else. So maybe when there's an error, the response status code, maybe response is null, and if response is null, then this thing's going to blow up, and we're going to have to try to traverse through all of this stuff to figure it out. Luckily, Google tends to be up most of the time, so we're actually pretty safe here, and we end up logging out 200 okay here for this. But what if we wanted to make this thing at all reusable? Well, we could do that by putting it in a function. Well, that sounds like we're getting towards functional, so let's see what that would look like. All right, so now we have a get Google, and to be able to deal with anything with this, because we've got these callbacks, which are passing functions, but it's still very, very imperative that we're passing these functions around like this, we have to provide a callback. And then we can issue the request to Google again. And then we can have our function again for handling our error or response in our body. And if it's an error, we're going to console error. And then if it's not an error, then we're going to call our call. We're going to pass the response status code into our callback. And so then what we could do is when we call this, we can say get Google and then just say console log is our function. That's our callback. So what's cool about that? Well, that's moved us a step closer to functional because we're now passing functions around. That's nice. We're able to set aside what we actually want to do as the result of calling this side effecty thing outside of the thing itself, and that's nice. And then it's a function which is reusable. We could extend this a little bit more to, rather than Google, we could pass in a URL or something, right? And so that ends up working fine. What we would see is that, we're going to get a 200. This is still going to work. We're still console logging the result from it, but we've been able to remove that console log from the internals of the implementation of this function. So that's another win. But that's still not good enough. Because issuing this request is a side effect. Logging to a console is a side effect. So we're doing side effects here, we're doing side effects up here. So all of those things are effectful things that are not pure in the functional sense. So now here we're going to come to, this is all of that written, very pure, very safe, and we're going to see what that looks like here. So we're going to start off by pulling in some usual suspects, future and IO, and then I'm just going to use R as Ramda here. Although I think all I'm using is compose and map from Ramda. But anyway, so now what we need to do is, the first step is going to be request is this side effecty thing. So we're going to wrap that up in a future. I've got several other videos on wrapping things in futures, but essentially if you've wrapped anything, I promise it's the same thing. We call the future function, we pass a future function, and we have essentially a callback here with reject and resolve parameters. We issue the request for whatever the URL is, and if there's an error, then we reject, else we resolve. Notice once again here that because this wasn't a statement, because I'm dealing with an expression here, I had to return either a reject or a resolve I couldn't go off and do all sorts of effectful things inside of this because I'm using this ternary, which is an expression. And then the other thing that we talked about doing was logging stuff to I/O. Well, if we want to log stuff, console log, what we want to do is we want to wrap that up in an I/O. So given an object, we'll return an I/O, which is just essentially a function that will put that object, we'll log it to the console. And then what we want to do is we want to say, what is our application? Well, at that point, our application then is just the composition of getting this request and then mapping the log of that to the I/O. So what the map is going to do here is, so request is going to return a future. So request is given some string. We're going to return a future of some error, or essentially status code in this case, so it's just a number. And then because that returns the future, the map is going to let us deal with the success case, the number here, and then we can call log IO and pass that value into log IO, which is then going to return an IO. So what we can tell here is that now our application is such that you give us a URL, a string in this case, and we're going to return a future of either an error or some IO operation that returns unit. So now we can see right here, here's all the different effects that this thing needs to have to be able to run. And each one of these things is an if-else check essentially, and try-catching even around doing all of those things, but we have no if-else checks and we have no try-catches in any of this. So we can call that, we can say, here's our app, we'll pass it Google, which was essentially was defined up here, it's just our URL. And then we're going to fork, which is actually going to run the future. And on the error case there, now we'll say we're at the application boundary. So sure, let's console the error out. We can do that. And in the success case, though, let's say that we can hit Google, everything's up. We're going to take that I/O. The success case is going to be the I/O here of a unit, or of nothing, void if you want to. And then we're going to run that I/O. And we see that if we run that, we get the exact same thing. We get 200 OK, but here we're all purely functional. So if we think about having an application boundary here, we can write this sort of code, this fork and dealing with console error. We can pick all of this stuff and we can put it in one place, and only ever one place, because it gets passed into everything else. So if you've done any object-oriented stuff, you can think about this like how you do like an IOC container where you wire everything up. That's what we're doing here. And since you only do that sort of wiring up in one place, now the rest of our application doesn't have to know about any of that other stuff. And we're purely functional. So there you have it. That's a full kind of, I'm going to call this an app, but basically going through, starting from very, very imperative, getting into that sort of callback hell thing that people talk about from Node, and really teasing everything out to where we end up with something that is purely functional, that actually does work, goes out, gets some stuff, runs some I/O, does some other stuff. So there's some building blocks. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Definitely let me know what you think. Is this the sort of thing that we want to be talking about from here on out, is actually building some stuff? Let me know. Thanks.